Hello, this is Lonnie with Rolling O Farm. This is part 2 in a 3-part series on rotational grazing. Now, in the first video, we talked about the concepts of rotational grazing and also the benefits of it. So if you haven't watched that video, I do encourage you to go back and watch that. However, in this video, we're going to talk about the planning that goes into rotational grazing, the timing that is necessary, and also some of the challenges. So come along. Before we get started, let me just say that if you're looking to buy goats and sheep and you're within driving distance of Northwest Alabama, give me a call, see what I have available. We try to specialize in starter herds and flocks and breeding stock. And so if you're in need of some goats or sheep, see what I have available. You can also check out our website at rollingofarm.com. Rotational grazing takes some planning. It takes planning because you need multiple sections of land that have all of the elements that your animals need. So a simple plan would be something like this. You take whatever property you have available to you, whatever area of land that you have, you divide it up into sections or paddocks, making sure that each paddock has 5 essential elements. The first of those 5 is containment. This is your fencing. You need some type of system to contain the animals in the area that you want them to be, but not only to contain the animals, but also to protect them from outside predators. So you need a good fencing system. Number 2 is you need adequate space. However large or small you decide to make your paddock, you need to make sure that there's enough space for the number of animals that you plan on putting in there. Number 3, you need to make sure that each paddock has an adequate food source. There needs to be enough grass or browse for the number of animals that you have in that space. Number 4, they need good, clean drinking water. So each paddock, each section needs to have a source of good, clean drinking water. And number 5, it needs to be some type of shelter. Now, if you have goats, that shelter probably needs to be some type of structure that keeps them out of the wind and the rain, like a barn. If you live in a warmer climate and you have sheep, you may be able to get away with just having a grove of trees or some thicket that they can get in and be protected from the wind and the cold just a little bit. But when you're planning out your rotational grazing and you're thinking about dividing your property up into different sections, you need to take into consideration whether each of those paddocks have these 5 essential elements. People always want to know, well, how many paddocks do I need? Well, that really depends on how frequently you plan on moving your animals. If you plan on moving them daily, then you're going to need a lot of paddocks. If you only plan on moving them every few weeks, then you probably won't need very many paddocks. Generally speaking, the more paddocks you have and the more frequently you move your animals, the better. Having 2 paddocks is better than 1, having 4 paddocks is better than 2, having 8 is better than 4, and so forth. Your animals are going to be healthier the more often you move them onto a fresh paddock. That being said, most people are limited in the number of paddocks they can have based upon the resources that they have available. For instance, if I have a section of land but it only has 1 source of drinking water, then all of my paddocks are going to have to connect to that 1 source of drinking water, which is going to limit the number of paddocks that I can have. If I just have 1 shelter available, then all of the paddocks are somehow going to have to join into that shelter, and that's going to limit the number of paddocks that I can have. So you want as many paddocks as you can get, but most of the time we're going to be limited by the number of resources. So the more paddocks we have, the more of a challenge it is to make sure that each paddock has those 5 essential elements that we talked about. Whatever we can do to use only 1 section of our land while letting the other sections rest is going to be beneficial. If we had property divided just into 2 paddocks, we would want to graze our animals on 1 paddock for about a month and then move them over to the other paddock and continue to rotate back and forth monthly. Now, ideally, we would like to move them more frequently than that, but that will require more paddocks. Ideally, we'd like to move the animals every 3 to 7 days. And the reason for that has to do with the life cycle of the parasite that goats and sheep are most susceptible to, and that's the stomach worm. The stomach worm lays eggs that are deposited into the soil when the animal defecates on the property. Those eggs, if the weather conditions are right, can hatch out in 3 to 5 days, which means it's possible that within 5 days your animals could start to ingest the larvae of the worms that they are depositing on the property. So if we can move the animals more frequently, maybe every 3 to 7 days, we can stay ahead of that. Now, some people like to move their animals every 3 days. Some move them daily, some several times a day. That's a little bit too labor intensive for my operation. I have found that moving once a week works well for me. So how long should we rest a paddock before reintroducing the animals back into it? Well, in my opinion, it's best to wait probably 50 to 60 days. Now, that's a lot longer time than the pasture needs to be able to recover from being grazed. So why wait that long? Well, again, it has to do with the life cycle of the parasites that goats and sheep are susceptible to it. When a stomach worm lays eggs and it hatches into a larva, that larva can only survive if it is not ingested by another animal for about 4 weeks. But not all worm eggs hatch out at the same time, depending on the weather conditions, rainfall, moisture content, heat, all of those things. They hatch out at different rates. So in my opinion, it's best to wait about 50 to 60 days before reintroducing the animals to that paddock. If you wait that long, you should basically be bringing the animals back into a clean pasture. Now, if you're running multiple species, you may be able to utilize a little bit different strategy. In other words, if you are running sheep and horses or goats and cattle, then what you may be able to do is to bring the goats in, graze them on a particular paddock for 5 to 7 days, move them out, let that paddock rest for 30 days. That way it fully recovers, regrows the vegetation, then bring in the cattle and let them graze it. And then after 3 to 7 days, move them out, let that paddock rest for 30 days so that it regrows, and then move the goats back in. Now, the reason that you're able to do that is because goats and cattle don't have the same parasites. Sheep and horses don't share the same parasites. And so if you're running multiple species like that, you can do rotational grazing where you swap out one species for another species and they don't transmit the same parasites. That does not work if you're running goats and sheep. Goats and sheep are susceptible to the same parasites, and therefore you have to let the pasture rest a little bit longer. So what would this practically look like time-wise? Well, I like to rotate once a week, as I said. That just works well for my schedule. So if I have a pasture, what I want to try to do is divide that pasture roughly into 8 equal sections, 8 equal paddocks. And then I want to make sure that each of those paddocks has a water supply and shelter. And then I want to stock one of those paddocks with no more animals than I can comfortably graze there in a 7-day period. After 7 days, I'm going to move them to the next paddock and continue to rotate them through all 8 paddocks. Now, if I'm moving animals once a week through 8 paddocks, it's going to be roughly 50 days before I reintroduce them to that first paddock. That's plenty of time for the vegetation to grow back after being grazed, and it's also plenty of time to break the life cycle of the parasite. So you can see that rotational grazing provides some additional challenges. For one, it's going to increase your workload because you're going to have to regularly be moving the animals. And so that'll require you not only going out there moving the animals, but it may require you setting up temporary fencing and taking down temporary fencing or moving waterers. Over the course of the year, that can add up time-wise and effort-wise. So that's one of the challenges. A second challenge is it's going to require additional infrastructure. You're going to have cross fencing. Now that may be temporary cross fencing or it may be permanent cross fencing. It may also require you to run additional water lines or have additional structures for shelter. All of that can add up cost-wise. Probably the 2 biggest challenges to rotational grazing is providing each paddock with water source and also shelter. Now in part 3 of this video series, we're going to talk about some of the tools that will help us in rotational grazing, such as fencing and portable water solutions. let's conclude by just walking through an example of how we may plan out a rotational grazing system. For the sake of this illustration, let's say that we have 10 acres of usable property. And so we've got it fenced off, and now we want to try to divide it up into different paddocks for rotational grazing. Well, let's say that we're going to try to divide it up roughly into 8 different paddocks that have generally the same amount of forage in each paddock. Now, if we only have one water source available on this property or one shelter available on this property, then we may have to get creative in trying to figure out how we can make all 8 paddocks funnel down and connect to the water source or to the shelter. If water and shelter are easily accessible throughout the property, then we may be able to divide that up in a more uniform way. Things that we're looking for is to make sure that each paddock has those 5 essentials that we talked about to begin with. Proper containment, adequate space, adequate food, fresh drinking water, and shelter of some type. And so we're trying to lay it out where we're able to do that. One other consideration is to think about the ease of movement for the animals from one paddock to another. If possible, I want the flow of rotation to be as easy as possible as I move the animals from one place to another. Something that I found useful to do is to look up a satellite image of your property and to be able to print that off or to take a screenshot of that and then be able to actually draw on that your fence lines and how you want to divide up that property. That makes it really easy in the planning stage to be able to see exactly how that land lays out, maybe how many trees you have in this section, how much open pasture here, where your water sources are, and you're kind of able to see all of that from the bird's eye view and plan that out. I also use that map that I make of my property with the different paddocks to record when the animals were grazed in each paddock. And that way I can keep up with how long it's been since they've been in a particular paddock, how long each paddock has been rested. With a little planning and forethought, you can set up a system for rotational grazing that should be able to work on your property. And the beauty of rotational grazing is that the longer you practice it, the healthier your pastures and your animals are going to be. So it's well worth taking the time to plan out a system that'll work for you and work for years to come. Now, in part 3 of this series, we're going to talk about some tools that I have found are very helpful in a rotational grazing system. Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be profitable, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and as always, happy farming.